Hi, I'm Ian Griffiths, and this is a talk from the Building Business Applications in Silverlight series. In this talk, we're going to take a look at out-of-browser, or OOB, applications. So in the context of our example, the goal we're going to try and fulfill here is to provide an administrative dashboard application. So that the broad idea is that administrators are going to be able to monitor for existing users who've registered but have not yet had their registration acknowledged. So we can do things like keep track of which users are there, provide toast notification pop-ups for the administrators so they can see when they've got work to do, and also be able to do things like send email via Outlook. So we're going to write this as an out-of-browser application that is separate from the main app that the rest of the system uses, partly because we don't want end users to have these services, but also because there are some Silverlight features that are only available to us when we run out-of-browser. In particular, the COM interop, the ability to talk to Office, is a thing that requires out-of-browser operation, and also the toast notifications only work out-of-browser. So in this first part, we're just going to look specifically at that one detail, the out-of-browser stuff, and what that means for a Silverlight application, and also what it means for things like authentication. So there's several different reasons you might want to go out-of-browser. I just discussed the reasons that our application needs to have an out-of-browser component, but there's several reasons you might want to do it. It might simply be that an out-of-browser application better suits what you're doing. It might just be a natural fit. Perhaps the browser Chrome around the outside just does nothing. Maybe your application is not naturally navigation oriented, and so having the back button and the history and the address bar just is a waste of screen real estate, and running outside of the browser would just be a more natural fit. Or possibly you want to run offline. Offline operation in Silverlight is only available to out-of-browser applications. And there are a few other features in Silverlight which again only work out-of-browser. So as I mentioned, elevated trust so you can do COM interop requires you to be out-of-browser. Only out-of-browser apps can request full permissions. And that means certain features are out of bounds unless you're outside the browser. Toast notification is another one. Window placement is another one. So there's a few sort of feature-driven reasons you might want to use it, besides the fact that it might just be a more natural fit for what you're doing. If you are going out of browser because you have to, then you need to write a little bit of code to work out whether the user has tried to run you from within the browser. Because initially, the first way the user is going to see your application is on a website, because until they've installed it for out-of-browser operation, it's not going to be on their computer. They've got to go to a web page to get hold of the ZAP file in the first place. So initially, when they first see the application, you will be out of browser, and you'll have to detect that and make sure you don't try and run the full out-of-browser UI. You're going to have to run just a different in-browser user interface that says, look, this application requires OOB. Please install the thing and run it again. And the way we do this is to interrogate the application object. So the application object provides properties. It provides an is running out of browser that tells you whether right now you're running out of the browser. Separately from this, you can discover whether the application has been installed, because it's for out of browser use. Because of course it's possible that you'll find yourself in a situation where the user has already installed you for out of browser operation. They already followed the instructions you gave them when they first run the app. But for whatever reason, they've arrived at your application through the web browser again. So in that case, you don't want to tell them, please install this application, because they already have. Instead, what you need to do is tell them, please could you run this from the start menu, or from the normal Windows or Mac way of running it, rather than running it through the web browser, because it needs to be run that way. Unfortunately, there isn't any way that you can tell the Silverlight that you'd like it to run the out-of-browser version of the app. So you can't provide a button that the users can click to launch the thing out of browser if it's already installed. Slightly incongruous, because when you first install the app for out-of-browser usage, it does actually run the thing right there and then. But once it's already installed, there's no way of kicking off the out-of-browser version. You have to get the user to go into the Start menu or the Applications folder and run the application themselves. So there are three scenarios we have to deal with. Not yet installed, installed, but we're running in the browser and we don't want to be, or we are actually running in the browser. And so the is running out of browser lets us detect that last one, and then the install state lets us detect the others. And typically the way we deal with this is just to have three different user controls that we just choose at runtime. We can say, which state are we in? Should we show the we're not installed yet control? Should we show that we are installed but you're in the browser control? Or should we show the main UI control? You just write the code behind in your main page to load the appropriate control at startup, and that's how we deal with this. For any of this to work, you have to have enabled out-of-browser operation in the application manifest, which you typically do by going and checking the relevant checkbox in the project properties. Now, authentication can present a challenge. Often with Silverlight applications, and particularly with business applications, you're going to have some sort of communication with the back end. And so the server needs to know who you are. The server needs to have some idea of what user identity you're coming in with, so it knows which operations you're allowed to do, and maybe it needs to present customized information that's specific to a particular user as well. Now in practice, actually, the way this works for out-of-browser applications doesn't need to be particularly different from how it works for in-browser applications. So in our example application, remember we're using rear services, which is optional, but if you are using that, then the mechanisms you use to authenticate don't change when you go out of browser. The authentication in rear services, if you use the Silverlight business application template, it ends up presenting you with a login dialog, and that uses a login method on a back-end service for authentication. It basically passes your username and password into the service, which then uses the ASP.NET API for authenticating you under the covers, and then sends you back a cookie once you're logged in. That works equally well in browser or out of browser, because it's all just web services over HTTP at the end of the day, and it doesn't really matter whether you're in the web browser or not. However, if you're not doing rear services, then perhaps things may be different, particularly if your Silverlight application is normally part of a larger web app, and maybe you're using forms-style authentication, and so that you've had a web page the user has had to log into before they can use the application to its full extent, and maybe your Silverlight application was a part of that. If you're running in the browser, you can just piggyback off the existing cookie handling for the HTTP stack. But if you're out of browser, that becomes more complicated. Obviously, the user hasn't gone in through the website to log in the first place, so somehow you're going to have to arrange to authenticate. And there's several different ways you could do that. The way that rear services happens to do it is probably the simplest way. You could just do something very similar yourself. If you're writing a custom web service, you could just arrange for the credentials to be passed in, and then just call the relevant ASP.NET methods yourself. So just basically expose the login method that a web page would normally use, just by submitting a form, just expose a similar thing as a web service and do it that way. Now, if you're using integrated authentication, things actually tend to be simpler. There, working out of browser, by default, your credentials would be passed straight through anyway, so you've actually got nothing more to do. You can just have that working straight away. So we're going to look at a couple of features here. We're just going to see how to turn on out-of-browser operation. I'll also show you how to debug out-of-browser operation, and we'll take a look at some of the authentication issues. Now, so that we can look at everything in isolation, I'm not going to show you this in the context of the full example application, because I want to show you some features that would work whether we're using rear services or not. So what I've written here is a very simple Silverlight application with a corresponding web project. And if I just run this up, for some reason my Control F5 shortcut has stopped working. Oh no, it's just hidden the window. There we are. So I've got a Silverlight application here. It's this bit down here, but it's surrounded by a containing web page. I've changed this a little bit. I've not got the usual full frame Silverlight application. I've narrowed it down a bit, and I got some HTML up here. That first bit of HTML, I've actually used an ASPX page here to pull out the current authentication status as far as the ASP.NET infrastructure on the server side is concerned. And it's saying right now that I'm not authenticated. And I've also written a handler that would generate an XML document containing the authentication information. If I click on this XML format link, this feeds back an XML document which contains information about whether the user is authenticated, and right now the user is not, and if they are, what their username appears to be, and also the method by which they were authenticated. So right now we're getting no authentication at all. But if I go to my web config file, the reason we're getting no authentication is because I've turned off authentication in the web.config. If I change this to be Windows authentication, if I now do a Control F5 to refresh this, we can see that I am authenticated, and right now I'm logged in as Redmond/John Papa because I happen to be using his machine. And we're authenticating using integrated auth. And again, if I go back and do a Control F5 to refresh the page, again, John Papa is showing up as the username, NTLM to indicate integrated authentication is there. So we can see that the web page is showing the same thing as the XML format. And here's the thing. My Silverlight application I have configured with this button here, which goes and fetches that same XML document. So in theory, we should see all the same information, which is exactly what we do. We're saying, yes, we're authenticated, yes, it's John Popper, and NTLM to indicate that we're using integrated authentication, and the status response code we got back from HTTP was the OK, the 200 message. And so far, that's exactly as we'd expect, because the default behavior, if you don't specify otherwise with Silverlight code, is that you end up using the same HTTP stack as the browser itself uses. So everything goes through the same mechanism, so it's no surprise we see the same results. If I go back here and turn this back to none and fetch again, then authentication gets switched back off again. The surrounding web page hasn't updated because I haven't refreshed the browser, but if I do a Control F5, we go back to being not authenticated. Now, there's one more thing I want to show you, because there is a new feature in Silverlight 4 that we can exploit, which is custom basic authentication. Now, the authentication element in ASP.NET doesn't provide a direct way of exploiting basic authentication, which is a standard HTTP mechanism for authenticating yourself. People are often interested in it because some REST-based services do actually rely on this as a means of authentication. If you're writing raw web services and you're consuming these from Silverlight, you may find yourself in a position where you want to be able to provide a username and password at the HTTP level over basic authentication or digest authentication. And that used not to be possible, but Silverlight 4 has added the ability to do this. So I'm going to turn on a custom module that I've written in this application. I'll just quickly show you the code for this. I've written an HTTP handler that looks, sorry, that's the handle that shows the XML document. I've written an HTTP module which handles requests and basically forces authentication. So if the user is unauthenticated, it will generate a 401 response code, which is the standard way of telling the browser that they need user credentials. And we've asked for basic authentication. And then my actual validation logic, I dig out the username and password the user has passed in. My validate user is highly secure. We say, did they provide a username? They must provide one, and the username and password must be the same. There we go, maximum security. So that's what I've got there. So if I save the web config out, now all of my requests should end up, if I close the browser, if I rerun the browser, so Internet Explorer is showing me its usual dialog asking me for user credentials. So this is what you get if you go to a website that asks for a username and password to be provided. So I just type Ian and Ian, that will work. And if I click Get, it didn't ask me again because by default Silverlight uses the web browser's HTTP stack. And so it behaves in exactly the same way as if I just navigated to a link on the browser. If I follow this XML format link, then the browser has remembered the credentials I've typed in. I didn't check the checkbox to remember them, but that means it just won't save them persistently. It will remember the username and password for the duration of this browsing session, so that I don't have to keep typing them in on every single page. So it will continue to send them until such time as I close down the browser, at which point it will stop sending and I'd see the dialog again. And because Silverlight is using the browser stack, it gets to pass the information in. So this is authentication details, and you might be wondering, what does this have to do with out-of-browser stuff? Well, what I'm now going to do is I want to install this application for out-of-browser operation. So I want to show you what happens to authentication when you start to run out-of-browser. So first thing I need to do is go in here and check the checkbox that says Enable running application out of the browser. I'll save that. I'll build it again. And now if I right-click, I get an extra menu item. Install SLAuth tests application onto this computer. So by default, the title of the application is just whatever name you gave the project with the word application tacked on the end. So if I click on this, it brings up a confirmation dialog to say, do you want this installed? Where do you want links to this? Do you want them in the start menu or the desktop or both? I'm going to click OK. And it then runs the application. We are now running out of browser. So you might be wondering what happens if I click Get. I get the same dialog, because actually by default, I'm still going to carry on using the same HTTP stack. So it's still using the browser HTTP stack even though I'm out of browser. I have to specifically ask for the client HTTP stack if I want something different. So I see the same pop-up as before. And because I'm running out of browser, it's now no longer remembered the credentials, which is why it's asking them for me one more time. So let's use different ones just to verify this. I'm going to do foo and foo. So here we're authenticating as foo with custom basic authentication. Over here in the browser, I've hit a breakpoint. Let me come out of that. I'm authenticating as Ian, because that's the credentials I typed in over here. So two different processes, the out-of-browser one and the web browser, both remembering their own different sets of credentials, but the same basic mechanism under the covers. So we can continue to use the same style of authentication. If I change this, if I take this back out again and move back over to Windows authentication and run one more time, so we're back to authenticating with John's credentials because I'm running this demo on John's machine. So the in-browser one works like that. If I run the out-of-browser app, which is now going to be my start menu, SL auth tests, that's the one. So this is running out of browser, click get again. Still authenticates as John, because obviously I'm on John's machine. That's going to be the case throughout. And I don't get any credential pop-ups now because that's the whole point of integrated authentication. Having already logged in, I don't need to provide credentials again. It just says it's me, or John in this case. So, one thing you may have noticed there is it's slightly irritating that I had to go and run the application from the start menu. You might want to run out-of-browser apps from within the debugger. Well, actually, you can do this. If I go to the properties of the client-side application and go to the debug tag, rather than the default behavior for debugging a Silverlight application, which is to debug in a web page, I can say, actually, I'd like to use an installed out-of-browser application. And you can tell it which web project you use to install the thing from. It needs to know that because the origin of the ZAP file is significant when it comes to identifying a particular out-of-browser application. So this says, please give me the out-of-browser experience, but as though hosted from this website. If I now make my Silverlight project the one that I start up on debugging, and I hit F5 to debug, now it runs the out-of-browser one straight away. So it launches the Silverlight host application for me, and I can debug here. And actually the nice thing about this is that if I make changes to the project, it will detect that and will automatically update. I don't have to go through a manual update process because Visual Studio is smart enough to go, well, you've just rebuilt and changed and you're debugging this project. You probably want to debug the one you just wrote rather than the one that's kicking around somewhere else on your hard disk. So it gives you a reasonably nice integrated experience for debugging that you wouldn't get if you carried on debugging through the web application. So that's a useful hint to know if you're working with out-of-browser applications. Now, the next thing I want to show you, though, is if I go back to turning on basic authentication, so put this back to none, so I'm not asking ASP.NET to do authentication, but I do want to turn on my custom basic authentication module. So just to recap, this is going to give me, when I click the Get button, it's going to ask me for credentials by hand. I might want to change that. I might want to say, well, actually, I'd like to provide credentials out of the box. Maybe I want to provide my own login user interface in here. Maybe I don't want to show the browser's one. Maybe I want to hard code credentials in. Not necessarily a brilliant idea, but there are situations in which that might make sense as a thing to do. For one reason or another, I might want to be providing the credentials programmatically rather than providing them through that pop-up UI. So how do we do this? Well, with the browser HTTP stack, you can't do it. But if you turn that off, you are free to make that work. So what we can do is we can ask Silverlight not to use the default browser stack. We can ask it to use its alternate stack known as the client HTTP stack. And we do this by going to the web request class, and we call the register prefix method that tells Silverlight we'd like to do something different for any HTTP for any web request that begins with the following prefix. I'm going to say any HTTP request. You can get more narrow than that, but I'm going to handle all of them. And then I can say, for these requests, please use system.net.browser web-request-creator.client HTTP. So this says I'd like to use the client HTTP stack rather than the default browser one. Now that I've done this, down here in my code that fetches the XML data, so this is the code on the client side, which goes and gets that auth details page that generates the XML document containing the login information. We execute the request, and then I'm just using link to XML to dig out the details. Well, here, after I created the request, I can say this. There's a couple of things I can do. I can tell it whether I'd like it to use default credentials or not. So I can turn off the use of integrated authentication, for example, that way. Or I can provide explicit credentials. And I can pass in a username and a password here. This might be something I've already acquired from the user when they typed in a login in my user interface. It might be a thing that I've hard-coded in my app because for whatever reason I happen to know I need to authenticate, but I don't particularly mind putting the credentials out in my user code. Maybe it's just a thing I need to do that's not going to cause me a security problem. Seems like I wouldn't recommend that in general, but there are situations where you might want to. But for whatever reason, your code might know the username and password it wants to use, and in here I can pass it explicitly. Now you might notice I've not changed any other code here. So you might be thinking, well, surely this would have worked even if I hadn't written this code here. It'll compile. However, if you try and turn off the use of default credentials or try and bring your own credentials when you're using the browser stack, you simply get an exception. Whereas here, because I've registered to use the client stack, I'm free to start making these changes as of Silverlight 4 and later. Silverlight 3 wouldn't actually work with this. You get a not implemented exception. So let's try this. I run, I click Get, and you can see we're still using my custom basic authentication mechanism, and we're now logged in as code, which was the username that I supplied from the code behind to log myself in. And other than that, the code continues to be the same as before. So, we've seen that configuring a browser application to run out of browser is as simple as checking a checkbox, and then once you've done that, the user can just right-click and select the install option, or we could write some code to give them an installation user interface. There's a useful debugging feature we could turn on in Visual Studio which tells it we'd like to debug the out-of-browser version, and that makes sure it launches the thing out of browser straight away. You can see I've no longer got the web browser UI here, I've just got the out-of-browser window on its own, and it automatically takes care of updating the zap so I get the right one each time I hit F5. So that's all relatively straightforward to work with. And then, specifically looking at authentication, we saw that, well, actually not a whole lot has to change on the client side if we don't want it to, particularly if we're using integrated authentication. That just continues to work as usual, so we can just do that in the same way. If we're using custom authentication using basic auth, or possibly digest auth, then we can now have the option to bring our own credentials. We're not required to. We get a pop-up asking for credentials if we don't bring our own, but now we have the option to do that through code as well. The only one that's sort of slightly more complicated is if you're using forms-based authentication, you do need some sort of programmatic mechanism by which you can perform the login that would normally be done through a web form. In the case of RIA services, they provide that code for you. If you're writing your own services, it's just a matter of writing an equivalent method yourself.